escalate the crisis. There's another crisis in the world today that some would say needs the intervention of somebody like you, and that's what's happening between Israel and the Palestinian people today. And I have to ask you, and I know the world, not just India, is interested in what you have to say on this. 200 people dead on the Palestinian side in Gaza, almost 80% of them children and women. One Israeli dead by comparison. Yet the statement we've seen from the White House, many people believe continues to be partial to the Israeli perspective. Where do you come in on this? How can this crisis be resolved? Do you believe Israel has been fair?
Well, first of all, Hamas was perfectly well aware what would happen if they started raining rockets into Israel. They fired 1,000 of them. And they have a strategy designed to force Israel to kill their own civilians so that the rest of the world will condemn them. Now, I believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu could and should make a comprehensive peace agreement with the Palestinians. I believe if he did it, and he did it with either President Abbas or with this coalition, in return for Hamas's renunciation of terror and recognition of Israel's right to exist, I believe 60% of the people of Israel would support it.
So what's holding him up?
Well, his coalition wouldn't support it, so he'd have to go to a national unity government to pass it. But I think that you would find that more than 60% of the Israelis support trying to defend themselves if they get 1,000 rockets shot at them. Now, they have a defense system against such missile attacks, the so-called Iron Dome, and they haven't died in great numbers yet, although they certainly could have. It's a miracle to me that they fired 1,000 rockets in there and more people weren't killed. So they know when Hamas attacks them that Hamas has set up a situation in which politically it can't lose, because they can say, well, if I attack them back, they always hide behind civilians and I'll kill civilians. And if I don't, we'll look like fools letting somebody shoot 1,000 rockets at us and not responding. What this proves is that there ought to be serious peace talks, serious ones. And I think the whole existence of this national unity government between the Fatah government on the West Bank and Hamas is the direct result of the lack of progress.
Do you blame Prime Minister Netanyahu, at least partially, for not moving fast enough on the possibility of peace?
I think they are partly responsible, but I also think, for example, when Hillary was Secretary of State, she helped secure an agreement, the only time Israel ever agreed to free settlements as a part of talks. They never had before. So they agreed to a 9-month freeze. And during that whole period, the Palestinians didn't want to talk to them. Then 3 weeks before the freeze expired, they said, okay, give us another 9 months and we'll talk to you. That was a big mistake. So there are mistakes on both sides. But the main thing is, they share this little piece of land and this big stretch of history. They know each other so well. They know how many children they have. They know how many grandchildren they have. They know what those grandchildren are doing. I mean, it's ridiculous. If you talk to them in private, you would swear they were all at a big family reunion. And they're either going to share the future on positive terms or share the future on negative terms. And that's the larger truth here. And they have to figure out what it is. Over the long run, it's not good for Israel to keep isolating itself from world opinion because of the absence of a viable peace process. But in the short and medium term, Hamas can inflict terrible public relations damage on Israel by forcing it to kill Palestinian civilians to counter Hamas. But it's a crass strategy that takes all of our eyes off the real objective, which is a peace that gets Israel security and recognition, and a peace that gets the Palestinians their state.
A couple of years ago, John McCain suggested that you would be the ideal person to be a Middle East peace envoy. Do you see that as a role you would take on, would want to take on, could take on?
Well, I called Senator McCain and accused him of trying to get me in trouble.
But seriously?
He's friends. We were old friends, and even when we fight, Hillary and I are good friends with John McCain. But I think, again, that's not, first, it won't happen. And secondly, it probably shouldn't. You know, you can't recreate the conditions that existed when I put together a proposal that Israel accepted and that Arafat didn't accept. But I do think it's worth remembering that at some point after the late Prime Minister Sharon became Prime Minister, at some point after that, Arafat said he would accept it, and we needed to fill in the blanks. Then, after that, when Mr. Abbas became the president of the Palestinians, he said that he would accept it. And by then, the internal politics of Israel had changed quite a bit. So I don't think I'm the person to do this unless they both came up and asked me to do it and the American government asked me to do it. And I think that chances of that are about as close to zero as you can imagine. But I think that the framework that we had is the framework they should begin negotiations with. Everybody knows if you're going to have a two-state solution what it has to be like. But it would be much harder today. You'd have to move more people out of, to give what we had before. 80% of the Israeli settlers could have been put on 3 to 4% of the land adjacent to the West Bank. Requires more land today, which means Israel will have to give up more. Then the number of settlers in the West Bank is so much greater, far greater than the settlers that had to be moved out of Gaza when Prime Minister Sharon, having changed his position on the peace process, unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. So we all need to have respect for how difficult this would be, but the framework has not changed. That's more important than the people. It's the leaders there that matter. They could almost do this without any help, except to provide some cover. It's on the one hand,
it's a sitting duck.
It's almost heartwarming how they know each other, and how in private they understand each other's problems, each other's positions. I mean, they're neighbors. It's a little piece of land. And I still think if that were resolved, it would take a great deal of the sting out of terrorist actions all over the world, including on this subcontinent.